No one in the terminal at Incheon International Airport recorded what happened near the departure gate that afternoon. The cameras caught the crowd. The cameras caught the luggage, the signage, the endless movement of strangers going somewhere that mattered to them. What the cameras did not catch was the moment a Korean Mafia boss looked up from his laptop and went still. He had been expecting nothing. Crowds, noise, delay, the ordinary friction of travel. What he found instead was a young black American woman sitting one seat away from him. Her body folded slightly inward, a white medical neck brace rising from the collar of her hoodie. One eye held the shadow of something recent. Her left arm pressed a backpack against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She didn't look at him. She didn't speak. For several seconds, she simply sat, too still, too careful, watching the terminal the way people watch for exits. Then she raised her hand. 2 fingers. Half a second. A gesture so small it disappeared before it finished. No one around them noticed. He did. And everything he thought he understood about that afternoon changed in the space of that single silent moment. Welcome to the channel. You're about to experience a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this story today. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And now let's dive straight into the story. Ne Dong didn't believe in accidents. He believed in patterns, in the angle of a shoulder, the rhythm of a breath, the particular quality of stillness that belonged only to people under watch. At 29, he had spent enough years reading rooms to know that most people revealed everything before they ever spoke. The body had no patience for silence. It always confessed first. The departure terminal moved around him with its usual noise. Business travelers staring at phones, families negotiating carry-ons, a child crying somewhere past the duty-free corridor, automated announcements cycling through languages no one fully listened to. Ne Dong sat in the middle of it with his laptop open and his attention divided between the screen and the room. Not because he was anxious. Because stillness for him was never passive. It was preparation. He looked like nothing. That was the point. Black suit, no accessories that announced themselves, hair combed back with the kind of precision that suggested discipline rather than vanity. To anyone passing, he was a businessman in transit. Someone returning from meetings that belonged to a world of conference rooms and quarterly reports. Someone unremarkable. Someone forgettable. He had spent years becoming exactly that. He was heading back to Seoul from a 3-day arrangement that had required his presence in person. The kind of business where trust was not extended through intermediaries. Where men sat across from each other in rooms with no recording equipment and made agreements that didn't exist on paper. Where the only currency that carried real weight was reputation, and the quiet, understood certainty of what happened to those who wasted it. The organization he led had no public name. It didn't need one. The people who needed to find him knew how. The people who didn't, never did. He had built that world carefully, deliberately, over years. He lived inside it the way other men lived inside careers and families and ordinary ambition. It was the only architecture he trusted. He opened a new document on his screen. He did not look up. Not yet. The name his mother gave him had not been used in years. Not by the men who worked beneath him, who spoke it only in the way soldiers speak the names of commanding officers, with distance built into the syllables, a careful gap between familiarity and consequence. Not by the rivals who knew of him, who tended not to speak it at all if they could avoid it. Not by the officials and detectives and intelligence analysts who had spent considerable resources trying to build a case around it and found, each time, that the architecture of their evidence dissolved before it reached anything solid. They called him Shadow instead. He hadn't chosen the name. It had arrived the way most true things arrived, without announcement, through repetition, through the accumulated testimony of people who had watched him operate and found no better word for what they'd witnessed. A man who moved without leaving traceable weight. Who arrived after decisions were already made and departed before the consequences became visible. Who existed to most of the world only as inference, the conclusion you reached when you looked at what had happened and tried to work backward toward a cause. Ne Dong had never corrected the name. It was accurate enough. He was 29 years old and had led the organization for 4 years, inheriting it under circumstances that the people inside it still discussed in careful, abbreviated language. The transition had not been clean. Transitions of that kind rarely were. But what followed had been methodical, precise, unsentimental. Within 18 months, the internal fractures had been closed. Within 2 years, the organization had expanded its reach across 3 countries without a single public incident that could be traced to its name. Within 3, the men who had doubted the succession had either revised their position or ceased to be a relevant part of the conversation. None of it had required excess. That was the thing people misunderstood about power in his observation. They imagined it was loud. They imagined it announced itself, that it required demonstration and spectacle and the visible performance of dominance. They modeled it on the wrong examples, on men who confused fear with respect, who mistook noise for authority. Those men burned quickly. They attracted attention, and attention was the beginning of erosion. Shadow had built something different, quieter, more durable, an organization that functioned the way well-designed infrastructure functioned, invisibly, efficiently, noticed only when something within it failed, which it rarely did. He had a particular mind for systems, for identifying the single point in a structure where pressure, applied correctly, produced movement in the whole. His subordinates called it intuition because they lacked a more precise vocabulary for it. It wasn't intuition. It was patience combined with attention. Most people watched the world in fragments, catching what was in front of them and discarding the rest. He had trained himself over years to hold the full frame, to register the peripheral, the incongruous, the detail that didn't belong to the pattern around it. It was a useful quality in his profession. It was, occasionally, a burden in everything else. He felt it now, sitting in the departure terminal with his laptop open and a document on the screen that required his attention, a mild and persistent awareness that his surroundings were organizing themselves into information whether he invited them to or not. The family to his left, 2 rows forward. The businessman near the window who had checked his watch 4 times in 6 minutes. The airport staff moving at a slightly elevated pace near the far corridor, suggesting a delay that hadn't been announced yet. He catalogued these things without deciding to, filed them in the part of his mind that ran continuously beneath whatever else he was doing, a background process, quiet and automatic, that had kept him alive long enough to become someone worth knowing about. He returned his eyes to the screen. Somewhere in the terminal, a child was crying. A flight was being called in 3 languages. The afternoon light came through the glass walls at a low, flattening angle and made the whole terminal look briefly like a photograph of itself. He did not look up. Not yet. Wait, before I continue. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because this next part is insane. She sat down without a word. That was the first thing he registered. Not her appearance, not the neck brace, not the backpack she pulled against her chest the moment she settled into the seat. The first thing was the silence of her arrival. Most people announced themselves when they sat in public spaces. They exhaled, adjusted, made the small sounds of someone claiming temporary territory. She made none of them. She lowered herself into the seat beside him with the practiced carefulness of someone who had learned that drawing attention carried a cost. He didn't look up from his screen. But the background process, that quiet, continuous register, had already begun its work. He noted the neck brace first because it was the most visible thing, white against the gray of her hoodie, a cervical collar fitted with the kind of precision that suggested a medical professional had placed it rather than the person wearing it. He noted the hoodie itself, oversized, the sleeves pulled down past her wrists despite the temperature of the terminal, which ran warm the way all large enclosed spaces ran warm. He noted the backpack, black leather, pressed to her chest with her left arm wrapped around it in a grip that had nothing casual in it. He noted the bruising. He didn't stare. He didn't need to. The peripheral was enough. The shadow beneath her left eye, the discoloration along the line of her cheek that foundation had been applied over but not fully obscured. Recent. A week at most, probably less. The kind of bruising that still held its original shape, that hadn't yet begun the slow migration through yellow and green that marked the later stages of healing. He turned a page in the document on his screen. She had not looked at him once. That, too, was information. In his experience, people who sat beside strangers in public spaces almost always made some minimal acknowledgement of shared proximity. A glance, a slight adjustment, the brief and wordless social contract of coexistence. She had offered none of it. Her eyes were directed downward and slightly to the left, toward the middle distance between the floor and the gate across the terminal. Not looking at anything. Watching everything. He recognized that particular quality of gaze. He had worn it himself in rooms where the wrong movement could change the nature of an evening. It was the gaze of someone performing stillness while internally tracking every exit. He let another minute pass. She hadn't moved except to tighten her hold on the backpack by a degree he might have missed if he hadn't been paying the kind of attention he was paying. A man in a dark jacket had walked past their row and her entire body had responded. Not dramatically, not in any way a casual observer would have caught, but the shoulders had drawn fractionally inward, the jaw had set, the breathing had gone shallow and then resumed. The man passed without slowing. She didn't relax. She simply waited to see what came next. Ne Dong closed a tab on his laptop and opened another. He was thinking now in a register that had nothing to do with the document on his screen. The mind that built systems, that looked for the single incongruous detail in a larger pattern, had shifted its attention fully and was working through what it had gathered with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The injury was not from an accident. He couldn't have explained the certainty with precision. It was the accumulated weight of small things rather than any single fact. The way she held herself. The selective nature of her fear, triggered by specific stimuli rather than general anxiety. The concealment. The practiced invisibility. These were not the behaviors of someone recovering from a collision or a fall. These were the behaviors of someone managing an ongoing situation. Someone for whom the danger had not passed simply because the immediate moment was calm. The neck brace was real. What had put it there almost certainly wasn't the story that accompanied it. He looked at his screen. Outside the glass walls, a plane was taxiing slowly through the flat afternoon light, moving with the patience of something that had no reason to hurry. He waited. 7 minutes passed. He knew because he had been tracking time the way he tracked everything else in the terminal. Not deliberately, not with effort, but as a function of the same continuous attention that catalogued the light shifts through the glass and the changing density of foot traffic near the gate. 7 minutes since she had sat down. 7 minutes of that practiced, costly stillness. She hadn't spoken to anyone. No phone calls. No messages that he could observe. She had not eaten or drunk anything, had not checked a departure board, had not done any of the ordinary things people did when they were waiting in airports and had nothing to fear from waiting. She simply sat with the backpack against her chest and watched the middle distance and performed the appearance of calm with the exhausting precision of someone who had been performing it for a very long time. He was about to return his full attention to the screen when he saw the man. Dark jacket, unhurried pace, moving along the row of seats from the far end of the gate with the particular quality of motion that belonged to someone retracing a route rather than discovering one. He had passed this row before. Ne Dong had logged it without flagging it. Now he flagged it. The man's eyes moved to her before his body drew level with their seats. Her response was immediate and invisible. The shoulders. The jaw. The breath that shortened and then was controlled back into regularity with a discipline that should not have existed in someone her age in an airport terminal on an ordinary afternoon. Her gaze dropped further. Her grip on the backpack tightened until the leather creased. The man slowed without fully stopping, glanced toward the gateboard, and continued past. She did not watch him go. She knew better than to watch him go. Ne Dong's hands were still on his keyboard. He had not moved. But something in his attention had sharpened past its usual register, past the background process and into something more deliberate, more present, the way a frequency became audible when the surrounding noise dropped away. He watched her from the edge of his vision. For a long moment she was completely still. Then, with the gradual and careful resolution of someone who has made a decision and is committing to it before they can reconsider, she raised her right hand. It moved slowly. Not toward him. Not in any direction that could be read as intentional by anyone watching from a distance. Her elbow rested on the armrest between their seats and her hand rose to the side of her face in what looked, to the rest of the terminal, like fatigue, like a woman with a neck injury pressing 2 fingers to her temple because she was tired and in pain and needed a moment. 2 fingers extended, ring and middle, pressed lightly to the side of her head just above the ear. The gesture lasted less than 3 seconds. Then her hand dropped back to her lap and she was still again, her face forward, her breathing even, giving nothing away to anyone who might be watching. But the signal was not about fatigue. He knew it the moment he saw it. Knew it with the immediate, unlayered certainty of recognition rather than deduction. The specific placement of the fingers. The angle. The stillness that preceded it and the stillness that followed, both calibrated to make the gesture disappear inside a gesture that meant nothing. It was a distress signal. Structured, deliberate, learned from somewhere and deployed now in the only way available to her. Silently, minimally, directed at no one in particular and therefore at anyone who might understand it. He understood it. He closed his laptop. Not quickly. Not with any movement that announced itself to the row of seats or the man in the dark jacket, wherever he had positioned himself now. He closed it the way he did everything, with a patience that looked like indifference and contained, beneath it, the full and absolute weight of a decision already made. He had seen this before. He had not acted. He was not going to make that mistake again. Pause. Subscribe real quick. And drop your country in the comments. You need to witness what happens next. Her name had been Suyun. He didn't think about her often. He had trained himself out of the habit the way he had trained himself out of other habits that served no operational purpose. Through repetition, through deliberate redirection, through the same discipline he applied to everything that threatened to compromise the quality of his attention. Grief was a distraction. Guilt was worse. They were weather systems that moved through a man and left the landscape altered in ways that took years to fully inventory. He had done his inventory. He had believed himself finished with it. The signal the girl beside him had just made said otherwise. Suyun had been 22. The younger sister of a man who worked within his organization, not close to the center of it, not someone with access to anything sensitive, but present enough at the periphery that Ne Dong had known her face, had exchanged words with her on the few occasions she appeared at gatherings she probably should not have attended. She had been quiet in the way some people were quiet, not from temperament but from learned caution, from years of adjusting her volume to the preferences of whoever occupied the room with her. He had noticed. That was the part he returned to, when he returned to it at all. He had noticed the signs. The way she moved around certain men. The bruising that appeared once along her collarbone and was never directly addressed by anyone who saw it. The particular quality of her silences, which were not peaceful. He had noticed, and he had filed the information in the part of his mind reserved for things that were not his problem, for the personal arrangements of people at the edges of his world, which operated by different rules than the world he managed and therefore, he had told himself, required a different kind of restraint. He had not intervened. He had reasoned, with the cold and efficient logic that had served him well in every other context, that involvement in the private matters of peripheral people created complications. That drawing that kind of line, deciding whose personal circumstances warranted his attention and whose did not, was a precedent with no clean edge. That the organization required him to remain above the granular, to maintain the distance that made clear judgment possible. He had believed all of it. For months later, Suyun was gone. Not dead as far as anyone could confirm. Simply gone, removed from her apartment, from her phone contacts, from the thin digital record of her life, with a thoroughness that belonged to men who had done it before and understood exactly which threads to cut. Her brother had come to Ne Dong. Not for help, it was too late for help, but because he needed to say it to someone who had the power to have prevented it. He had stood in Ne Dong's office and said it quietly, without accusation, which was somehow worse than accusation would have been. You saw it. I know you saw it. Ne Dong had not answered. Because the answer was yes. He had carried that yes for 3 years. Not visibly. It had not altered his operational effectiveness, had not softened his decisions or introduced sentiment into processes that required its absence. He was not a man who allowed interior weather to become exterior weather. But it was there. A fixed point in the architecture of his self-assessment that did not shift regardless of what he built around it. Attacks on everything that followed, paid quietly, never in full. He had seen it and he had not acted, and someone had disappeared. Now he sat in a terminal in Incheon with his laptop closed and his hands resting on its surface, and a young woman 1 seat away from him who had just made a signal that lasted 3 seconds and contained within it the entire specific weight of everything he had failed to do 3 years ago. The man in the dark jacket was somewhere in this terminal. She was still performing her stillness beside him, holding it together with the focused effort of someone standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom. He would not file this away. Not this time. Hold up, subscribe first. Then comment your location. Now brace yourself. This story is about to explode. He didn't move immediately. That was important. Moving immediately was the mistake men made when urgency overtook method, when the emotional logic of a situation outpaced the operational logic, and the result was action that announced itself before it had accomplished anything. He had seen it cost people everything. He had learned, at considerable expense, that the most effective interventions were the ones that looked like nothing from the outside. That looked, to the man in the dark jacket somewhere in this terminal, like an unremarkable afternoon continuing to be unremarkable. He picked up his phone first, opened it with the casualness of someone checking messages, typed 3 words to a contact listed under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. Then he set the phone face down on his laptop and let another 90 seconds pass. When he spoke, he didn't turn his head. "You don't have to look at me." His voice was low and even, calibrated to carry exactly as far as the seat beside him and no further. "Just keep looking forward." He felt the change in her breathing before she contained it. A sharp, involuntary catch. Fear first, because a stranger speaking without warning was threat before it was anything else, and her nervous system had been trained to that calculation. Then the containment. Then a stillness that was different from the stillness before, charged with attention rather than performance. She didn't look at him. "I saw what you did," he said. "The signal. I know what it means." A long pause. 3 seconds, 4. He waited it out. There's a man watching this gate. He kept his eyes on the middle distance, a businessman with mild thoughts, nothing urgent. Dark jacket. He's passed this row twice. Is he the reason you made that signal? The pause this time was shorter. Then, almost imperceptibly, she dipped her chin. Once. Downward and back up. Less than a centimeter. It was enough. "Don't react to what I'm about to tell you," he said. "Keep your face exactly as it is." He gave her a moment to prepare. "I'm going to help you. You don't need to know who I am or why I'm choosing to do this. What you need to know is that I am not going to walk away from this gate and leave you here. That is not what is going to happen this afternoon." He heard her breath change again. Something in it that was not quite sound. A pressure release that had been building for long enough that the release had its own particular quality. Not relief, not yet. Relief required safety, and she was not safe yet, and she knew it. But something adjacent to relief. The specific feeling of a door appearing in a wall that had presented, until that moment, as solid. "I need you to do something small," he continued. "In the next few minutes, I'm going to stand up and move to the seat on your left side, closer to the window. When I do, I want you to shift the backpack to your right arm. Just the backpack. Nothing else changes." He paused. "Can you do that?" The chin dip again. Fractional, controlled. Good. He didn't speak after that. He let the silence return to its previous shape, let the terminal resume its ambient noise and movement around them, let the tableau of 2 strangers sitting in proximity with nothing between them reassemble itself for anyone who might be watching. He checked his phone once more. A response had arrived in the time since he'd sent his 3 words. He read it and set the phone down and felt the organization, that quiet, efficient architecture he had built over years, begin its first remote movements around a situation it had not yet been fully briefed on. That would come. For now, what mattered was this. She had made a signal into a crowded terminal with no reason to believe anyone would understand it, From a place of fear so established it had become her normal weather, and he had understood it. He had understood it, and he had spoken, and she had answered. The quiet promise was already made. He had no intention of breaking it. The report arrived in fragments, the way his intelligence always did. Not as a single document delivered cleanly at a single time, but as a sequence of incoming pieces. A message, then a pause, then another message, each one adding density to a picture that was assembling itself in real time from sources operating simultaneously across different channels. He had built the network to function this way deliberately. Singular pipelines created singular points of failure. Distributed information required distributed attention to intercept, and the men trying to intercept his communications did not have that kind of patience. He read each fragment without visible reaction, his phone angled toward his lap, his posture unchanged. The man in the dark jacket had a name. Marcus Hale. American. 38 years old. No criminal record in any jurisdiction that maintained public records, which was itself a kind of record. The negative space of a man who had learned early how to ensure that nothing he did left official residue. He operated primarily between Seoul, Manila, and Los Angeles, with a pattern of extended stays in cities with large transient populations, universities, and international airports. Places where young women moved through in volume. Places where a certain kind of disappearance took longer to be noticed. Ne-dong read that and felt something settle in his chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. The pattern went back at least 6 years, though the further back his people looked, the more diffuse the documentation became. What they had assembled in the past 40 minutes was enough. Marcus Hale identified targets through vulnerability. Women traveling alone, women with visible injuries, women who were financially precarious or geographically displaced. He approached them as assistance, as safety. He had a practiced fluency in the language of care, in the specific vocabulary that reached people who had not been treated with care in long enough that they had lost the ability to identify its counterfeit version. He would offer help with accommodation, with travel arrangements, with the bureaucratic and logistical complications that became, for some women in some circumstances, genuinely insurmountable without external support. He positioned himself as the solution to an immediate problem and allowed trust to accumulate in the space that relief created. By the time the nature of the arrangement became clear, by the time the control revealed itself beneath the generosity, the women were typically isolated enough that the revelation changed nothing practical about their situation. They were already inside it. 3 women in the past 4 years had been connected to Marcus Hale by Ne-dong's network through the kind of lateral research that official investigators rarely had the resources or the mandate to pursue. 3 women who had been, at various points, documented in proximity to him and then documented nowhere at all. No dramatic disappearances. No filed reports with his name attached. Simply women who had existed in a verifiable way and then, gradually, had stopped existing in any way that left a trace. He thought of Soo-yeon. He thought of her brother standing in his office saying you saw it with a quietness that had more weight than shouting would have. He set his phone face down on the laptop and looked at the terminal without seeing it for a moment, the way a man looks at a landscape when he is not looking at a landscape but working through something that requires stillness to process. Then he picked the phone back up. One name had surfaced across 2 of the 3 women. A house outside the city, registered to a shell company whose chain of ownership ran through 4 jurisdictions before it became opaque. The kind of structure that required both resources and instruction to build. Marcus Hale was not operating alone. He was operating as a component of something larger that had found, in him, a particular kind of useful instrument. This was no longer simply a man with a pattern. This was a supply chain. And Grace, sitting 1 seat away with her backpack against her chest and her neck brace and her 3-second signal, was somewhere in its current movement. Ne-dong typed 2 more words to the contact who had responded earlier. Then he waited, with the patience of someone who had already decided how this ended, for the next fragment to arrive. Don't blink. Subscribe, comment your country. Then watch what happens next. You're not ready. The house sat at the end of an unpaved road that didn't appear on commercial mapping applications. That was the first thing Ne-dong's operative noted when he filed the location. Not the address, which was registered to a logistics company incorporated in a jurisdiction that didn't ask questions, but the absence of it from the cartography that ordinary people use to navigate ordinary lives. Someone had taken deliberate steps to ensure the road remained undocumented. That kind of effort required both intention and resource. It confirmed what the financial trail had already suggested about the scale of what Marcus Hale was connected to. The house itself was unremarkable from the exterior. Single-story, high-perimeter walls with a gate that required a code, surrounded on 3 sides by dense treeline that ensured no sightlines from the road. It looked, from the outside, like a private residence belonging to someone who valued their privacy. Which was precisely the point. The most effective prisons were the ones that didn't look like prisons from the outside, that presented as care rather than confinement until the distinction had become irrelevant. Grace had been taken there 4 hours after the airport. Nadong knew this because one of his people had followed Marcus's vehicle from the terminal at a distance that suggested coincidence. A gray sedan 2 cars back, patient and unhurried, tracking without pressure. Grace had sat in the passenger seat with a backpack on her lap and her face directed at the window, and whatever she had been thinking as the city gave way to peripheral roads and then to the kind of quiet that belongs to places deliberately removed from density, she had not shown it on her face. She had learned that too, apparently. The containment of interior weather. Inside the house, the control had a structure. His operative, a woman, which had been the deliberate choice, someone who could read the texture of the environment in ways that required a particular kind of fluency, had accessed the property through a channel that took 2 hours to arrange and would take longer to explain. What she reported was assembled into Nadong's picture with the other fragments and completed something he had already understood in outline but now understood in detail. The house had 3 rooms that locked from the outside. The phones within it had restricted outgoing capability. Calls possible only to numbers on a pre-approved list, which consisted entirely of numbers that routed back to people within Marcus Hale's network. The internet access was filtered through a system that blocked search engines, social media, mapping tools, and any platform that might allow contact with the outside world. The filtering was sophisticated enough to suggest it had not been configured by Marcus Hale alone. Someone with technical competence had built the architecture and handed it to him. There were 2 other women in the house. That detail arrived in the report and sat there with the particular weight of information that expands a situation rather than clarifying it. Nadong read it twice. His operative described them carefully. Their approximate ages, their visible conditions, the way they moved through the house with the specific economy of people who had internalized, over time, the precise dimensions of what was permitted. They had been there long enough that the constraint had become their normal geometry. They no longer pressed against the edges of it. Grace had not yet reached that stage. She was still in the earlier phase, the transition period, when the control was being established and consolidated, when the geography of what was allowed was being drawn around a person gradually enough that they experienced it as circumstance rather than architecture. Marcus understood this phase. He was practiced in it. He would be patient and attentive, and the generosity would continue long enough for the isolation to become structural before the terms shifted. He had done it before. He intended to do it again. Nadong set his phone down on the table in front of him. A different table now, in a different location, the airport long behind him, and looked at the photograph his operative had sent of the exterior of the house. The tree lane. The gate. The unpaved road that disappeared from maps. He studied it for a long moment. Then he began to plan. If you're seeing this, subscribe now and drop your location. Destiny brought you here. The next scene proves it. They moved at 2 a.m. Not because darkness provided tactical cover. His people were competent enough to operate in any light, but because 2 a.m. was the specific hour when the particular kind of confidence that belonged to men like Marcus Hale reached its lowest point. The confidence of predators was diurnal. It peaked in the afternoon, in public spaces, in airports and terminals where the performance of normalcy provided its own protection. At 2 a.m. in a house at the end of an unmapped road, with a tree line pressing close on 3 sides and the nearest inhabited structure 40 minutes away, that confidence became something thinner. Something that knew, at its edges, what it had always been underneath. Nadong had 4 men with him. He didn't need more. The house had 1 gate, 1 primary entrance, 2 secondary exits that his operative had documented during her access 2 days prior. 4 men, correctly positioned, created a geometry with no useful gaps. He had drawn it himself on a plain sheet of paper the previous evening and then destroyed the paper, because the drawing was for the purpose of thinking rather than instruction. His people didn't require instruction at this level of operation. They required positioning and a time and the understanding that the objective was the safety of the women inside the house, which he had communicated with the precision and finality that ensured it would not be interpreted loosely. The gate took 11 seconds. The primary entrance took less. Marcus Hale was awake when they entered, not because he had been warned, but because men who ran operations built on the sustained control of other people developed, over time, a particular and unreliable instinct for threat. He was in the main room with a phone in his hand when Ne Dong came through the door, and the phone was already halfway raised before the calculation reached its conclusion and his arm lowered and he went still. He was good at reading rooms. It was his primary skill. He read this one correctly. "Sit down," Ne Dong said. His voice was the same voice he used in every room. Level, unhurried, containing within its quietness the full implication of what it would cost Marcus to make the wrong decision in the next 30 seconds. It was not a performance. It was simply what his voice had become after years of meaning exactly what it said. Marcus sat down. The confrontation that followed was not long. Ne Dong had no interest in theater, in the extended negotiation that men of Marcus's type sometimes attempted when they sensed an audience and believed that performance might create an opening. There was no opening. There was only the structured and complete dismantling of every practical protection Marcus had built around himself. The network contacts, the shell company, the financial arrangements, the names of the people above him in the supply chain that Ne Dong had already partially mapped and now confirmed in full. Marcus provided these things in the order they were requested, with the cooperation of a man who has correctly assessed that the person across from him already knows most of it and is offering, through the asking, a single limited opportunity to matter in the resolution of his own situation. It took 22 minutes. Then Ne Dong stood and walked down the corridor. Grace was in the second room. She was awake, had been awake, he suspected, since the sound of the entrance reached her, sitting on the edge of the bed with the backpack on her lap, still holding it the way she had held it in the airport terminal, as though it were the last solid thing. She looked at him when the door opened and her face moved through several things in quick succession. Fear first, always fear first, that was what months of this did to a person's reflexes, and then something that stopped at the threshold of recognition. She remembered his voice. He could see that she remembered it. He didn't speak immediately. He simply held the door open and waited. The waiting was important. The choice had to be hers. That was the entire point, that she moved because she decided to move, not because the geometry of the situation left her no alternative. She had been left with no alternatives for long enough. She stood up. She walked through the door. Behind her, the room that had been built to hold her receded into the dark of the corridor and became, in the moment she crossed its threshold, simply a room. 4 walls, a window with restricted light, furniture chosen for function rather than comfort. A space that had briefly organized itself around her captivity and would now be required to mean something else, or nothing at all. In the main room, Marcus Hale sat in a chair surrounded by consequences he had spent years believing he was sophisticated enough to avoid. Grace did not look at him as she passed. That, too, was its own kind of defiance, the refusal of even the weight of a glance, the final and complete withdrawal of the attention he had spent months engineering his way into. She looked forward at the open front door, at the night air coming through it from the direction of the tree lane, and she walked toward it with the careful, deliberate steps of someone choosing, for the first time in a long time, the direction of their own movement. Ne Dong walked beside her. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the unpaved road stretched toward a darkness that had, at its far end, the first pale suggestion of a different kind of morning. Before I reveal the truth, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. This twist changes everything. The safe house was in a quiet district of the city where the streets were narrow, and the buildings were old enough to have developed the particular solidity of structures that had outlasted several versions of the world around them. It was not one of his operational properties. He had been deliberate about that, had chosen instead a location maintained by a woman named Dr. Yoon, who ran a private resettlement practice with the kind of discretion that came not from fear of his organization but from a professional ethic so thoroughly internalized it had become indistinguishable from character. She had worked with women in fractured circumstances for 19 years. She did not ask Ne Dong questions about the origin of the situations he occasionally directed toward her. He did not ask her questions about her methods. The arrangement functioned on mutual respect for the other's competence, which was the only kind of arrangement he had ever found durable. Dr. Yoon met them at the door before they knocked. She looked at Grace the way clinicians with genuine vocation looked at patients, not with pity, which reduces, but with the particular quality of attention that takes full inventory without making the inventory visible. She said something quiet and practical about tea and the hour and the room that had been prepared, and Grace, who had not spoken more than a handful of words since she had walked through the door of the house on the unmapped road, looked at her and nodded. Ne Dong watched Grace cross the threshold. She still had the backpack. She had carried it through every hour of the past 2 days, through the terminal, through the car, through the house of control, through the night confrontation and the drive back into the city, as though releasing it required a form of safety she hadn't yet confirmed existed. He understood that. Some objects became load-bearing during sustained fear. They held things that had no other container. You didn't put them down until you were certain the floor beneath you was real. She paused in the doorway. For a moment she didn't move, and he thought she might turn around. Not to go back, there was nothing to go back to now, but because forward still required something from her that she was still assembling. Then she turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time. Not the peripheral awareness of the airport. Not the careful avoidance of someone managing threat. Directly. With the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. She didn't speak. Neither did he. There was a version of this moment, he was aware, that required words, that the shape of what had happened between an airport terminal and this doorway accumulated towards some kind of language, some exchange that named what had passed between two strangers on either side of a 3-second signal. He had nothing that felt equal to it. He suspected she didn't either. What had happened was not the kind of thing that language improved by touching. She turned back to the doorway and walked through it. Dr. Yoon closed the door softly behind them both. Ne Dong stood on the narrow street for a moment in the early morning quiet. The city was beginning its gradual reinstatement. The first sounds of distant traffic, the particular quality of light that arrived before the sun itself arrived, pale and directionless, illuminating without yet committing to warmth. A cat crossed the far end of the street and disappeared between two buildings without looking back. He thought about Su-Yun. He thought about her brother's quiet voice in his office 3 years ago saying you saw it. He thought about the fixed point in his self-assessment that had not shifted through everything he had built around it. He wasn't certain it had shifted now. He wasn't certain one right decision recalibrated the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it, or whether redemption worked that way at all. Whether it arrived in single moments or required something longer, something he didn't have a complete picture of yet. But the door had closed. And Grace was on the other side of it, in a room that locked from the inside. He put his hands in his pockets and began walking. Somewhere behind him, on the second floor of the building, a light came on. He didn't look back to see it. But he slowed, almost imperceptibly, for just a moment, as though some part of him already knew that what had begun in an airport terminal with a 3-second signal was not, in fact, finished. As though the story had only just decided what it was. If you enjoyed the story, please like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. Thank you for watching.